Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today we're going to be asking, does the problem of gratuitous evil provide really strong evidence against theism? And we'll talk about what gratuitous evil is, and I'm very honored to be joined for a second time by Dr. Klaas Kraay. Hey, Dr. Kraay.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
Previously, we did a discussion on pro-theism and anti-theism. You may be interested in checking that out if you enjoy this interview with him. So I'm going to go ahead and ask, how did you get interested in the topic of the problem of evil, and specifically this emphasis on gratuitous evil?
Yeah, right. Well, arguments from evil, I think, are some of the most foremost objections against religious belief, against theistic belief in particular, right? It's a family of arguments, and there are some really serious arguments against the claim that God exists in that family. And as I'll say in a few minutes, I think the arguments that focus on gratuitous evil in particular are some of the most challenging versions of those arguments for atheism. And I got interested in this particular part of the literature or part of the discussion because, there's, as I'll say in a few minutes, there's a kind of mainstream move here for responding to those arguments. But then there's also this kind of minority current running through the literature that actually makes pretty bold claims that God, as we'll see, might have good reason for allowing not just evil, but gratuitous evil. And that should strike listeners, if you haven't heard of this before, as a provocative and surprising and ambitious and challenging claim. So I got interested and wanted to explore it further.
I'm really glad you wrote this two-part article that was published in Philosophy Compass. For those viewers that don't know, I've come to discover the journal Philosophy Compass, and it's amazing because it provides these really helpful introductions to topics, and they're always well written and very clear, even for somebody that's not a specialist. So I was eager to read this.
They're very helpful. I'll second what you say about the journal, and I certainly read it myself as well, and that they're very helpful resources for specialists too.
The link to this two-part article is in the description of this video, so if you want to dig into some of the details, do that. Okay, let's begin by distinguishing between these two types of evil that often get brought up, and that's moral evil and natural evil. What are these two?
Yeah, good, right. So this is a good place to begin to set the stage a little bit, right? So I think most people would agree there's lots of evil in the world, and it's useful to distinguish two different types of it. So some evil, the term, by the way, is a bit paradoxical. Moral evil can sound, if you're hearing it for the first time, like what, it's evil, but it's somehow moral, or it's supposed to be good. It sounds a bit paradoxical, but the idea is not that. The idea is very simple. It's moral wrongdoing. It's the wrong actions or omissions committed by agents who have moral standing, let's say. So that's moral evil. In contrast, natural evil is the pain and suffering that is caused by, or at least some pain and suffering that's caused by natural forces, right? So earthquakes, forest fires, tornadoes, and so forth, right, cause an awful lot of pain and suffering, and it's not caused by any particular person, right? Or so we ordinarily think. There's no one who's morally responsible for these acts, at least in many cases. Set aside the forest fires that are caused by someone negligently flipping a cigarette into some dry leaves or whatever, right? A forest fire that's caused by lightning wasn't caused by any moral agent acting wrongly. It was a natural thing that happened, but it might cause a lot of pain and suffering, so that's called natural evil. So moral evil is the wrongdoing perpetrated by beings with moral abilities and liabilities, and natural evil is the pain and suffering that is not caused by those sorts of beings.
Very good. That was clear. So how have those types of evil been used to argue against the existence of God exactly?
Yeah, good. Well, let's start, and maybe you can put up the first slide, right? Let's start with a very simple argument, right?
Let me make this large screen. Okay, yeah. There we go.
Perfect. So yeah, if you look at the argument on the top, right, someone might say, well, look, if God exists, there shouldn't be any evil at all. There shouldn't be any moral evil. There shouldn't be any natural evil. There shouldn't be any pain and suffering. There shouldn't be any of it. That's the expectation that premise one of that argument sets out. But then you look around and you see an awful lot of evil of both types. So that seems like a straightforward empirical claim. There's lots of evil, or at least there's some evil. So the conclusion follows logically that God doesn't exist, right? Now, the typical way that this argument is challenged is by resisting premise one, not premise two, and certainly not the inference. It's a valid logical inference after all, right? So the claim is that, well, look, it's a mistake to think that God would never allow any evil at all under any circumstances. That's really what premise one is saying. Instead, you might say, well, look, God might have reasons for allowing some evil some of the time. And maybe those reasons, at least on some occasions, are morally sufficient. Maybe God has an adequate reason for allowing some evil some of the time, right? Maybe some evil is permitted in order to bring about a greater good, for example. Pretty familiar idea. Well, if anything along those lines is right, then premise one can be set aside, right? And it's an unreasonable expectation to think that if God exists, there wouldn't be any evil at all. If God could ever, even on one occasion, use evil to bring about God's purposes or to bring about a greater good or to prevent some greater evil from occurring, anything like that is sufficient to defeat premise one in this argument. So then the argument regroups, or people who want to argue for atheism in this way regroup, and they launch a more precise argument, which I call here the argument from gratuitous evil to atheism. So I'm going to get a little more technical in a minute or two about what I mean by gratuitous, but for now, since we're starting at a very basic level, let's just say that gratuitous means pointless. Okay, and we'll tighten that up in a minute. So you see here, I've revised premise one, premise two, premise and the conclusion, right? So premise one prime, the variant of premise one says, look, if God exists, sure, fine, there might be some evil, but there wouldn't be any pointless evil, right? There wouldn't be any evil that didn't bring about a greater good or that God had no reason for permitting. There wouldn't be any pointless or gratuitous evil. And then you look around and the argument says, but look, there's an awful lot of pointless or gratuitous evil in the world, right? There's at least some, right? And according to this argument, any instance of it counts against theism. So if there's any gratuitous evil at all, then according to this argument, atheism follows.
All right. Yeah, that was very clearly laid out. So let's focus in really on in this interview, we're focusing in on that second variant where gratuitous evil is in focus. So what is the most prominent response to this argument from gratuitous evil?
Yeah, right. So the most prominent response really accepts premise one prime. It accepts the expectation or the principle or the idea that God would prevent all gratuitous evil, that there wouldn't be any pointless evil if God were to exist, right? And so it tries to resist the second step in the argument by resisting the idea that gratuitous evil occurs. How do we know? Let's stay very sort of non-technical for now, right? Let's say gratuitous evil is just pointless evil. The question might arise, well, look, how do we know that some of this evil that some people are saying is pointless really is pointless? Maybe there's a point to it that we are unable to discern. Okay, that's a very short introduction to a broad and complicated topic, a way of thinking about these things that is sometimes called skeptical theism. So the term is very awkward. Paul Draper invented it and regrets having baptized it in this way. But the idea here is that the skeptical theist is someone who's skeptical of the idea that apparently gratuitous or apparently pointless evil really is pointless or gratuitous. Maybe it seems pointless or gratuitous, but isn't really. After all, God is much more complex than us. God is much more, knows much more than us and is much more powerful than us. So the basic idea is that God might have reasons for permitting evil that we can't discern, right? They're beyond our ken, to use a common phrase. So that's precisely what the person who deploys this strategy is skeptical about. They don't have to be a theist, by the way. That's one of the infelicities of this term. Anyone who wants to resist premise two in this argument by speculating that maybe some apparently gratuitous evils aren't really gratuitous is a skeptical theist, according to the term, whether or not they happen to believe that God exists. So it's a way of responding to this argument, saying maybe we should resist the second step in the argument. And there's an enormous, as I said a minute ago, there's an enormous and complicated literature on that argument that we're not going to talk about today, right?
Because today I'll just tease the viewers and say, if you're interested in hearing a case for and a case against skeptical theism, check out my interview with Dr. Justin McBrayer. on my channel. So
Terrific.
as a matter of fact, when we're done, I'll put that link in the description so people can find it pretty easily. Okay. But we're not going to be exploring the skeptical theism in this interview, because you're focused on people who resist this argument not by denying premise 2, but instead by denying premise 1.
Yeah,
Right?
that's exactly right. And that can seem, as I said in the intro, right? That can seem like kind of a shocking or an outrageous thing to think, right? Why on earth would God allow pointless evil, right? The denial of premise 1 says that it's not the case that if God exists, no evil occurs, right? So then that's committed to the claim that God and pointless evil are compossible, right? And that seems very surprising. A lot of, this is a minority view in the literature. The mainstream view in the literature, I think, is that something like premise 1 is a necessary truth, right? That it's something that everyone should accept, that God and gratuitous evil cannot coexist. So it's kind of a surprising and shocking thing that some folks in the literature think that they are compossible, that God and gratuitous evil could coexist, so to speak. And what's more, some very interesting and provocative arguments have been given for this claim, and that's what got me interested in it.
Excellent. So before we begin exploring how people resist premise 1, I want to get clear on a couple of terms. So let's be clear about what we mean by God, and let's also be clear about gratuitous evil, what that means exactly.
Yeah, good, right. So, as I'm sure and your viewers and listeners know, there's all sorts of conceptions of God throughout human history, throughout the history of philosophy and theology. There's all sorts of ideas about who or what God is. The sort of being that this argument is targeting, that both of these arguments are targeting, is the being who is omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, who exists necessarily, who is the creator and sustainer of all that is, right? Those kinds of attributes, that traditional idea, arguably central to the great monotheistic faith, that's the conception of God that this argument seeks to target. There are a lot that's certainly not the only conception of God that's out there. Perhaps it's not even the best conception of God that's out there, but that's a very mainstream one that this argument is seeking to target. Right? If you think that God isn't omnipotent, or maybe isn't very powerful at all, or isn't omniscient, or isn't very knowledgeable at all, well, then this argument isn't going to have a lot of purchase, right?
Yeah. Okay. So how about gratuitous evil? This will be really important, how we define gratuitous evil.
Yeah, good. So if you can move to the next slide, I'll walk through it a little bit here. So I'll explain the first one, and then I'll explain the second one in more simple language, which hopefully will make it readily intelligible. So let's say that the first idea of gratuitous evil is this: an instance or an occurrence or an event of evil, the occurrence of which doesn't make the world overall better. It doesn't improve the world overall. Okay, so very loosely, it's pointless. There's no point to it, right? More precisely, the happening, the occurrence of it doesn't make the world overall better. There are other ideas of gratuitous evil out there, but the main distinction I want to draw is between whether the occurrence of the event does or doesn't make something better, versus, and this is where we get to GE2, whether God's permission of the event or the instance of evil does or doesn't make the world overall better. So these are two different ideas. The first idea is that some event occurs, some instance of evil occurs, and that occurrence doesn't make the world better. Maybe it even makes the world worse. The second idea is that God's permission of it fails to make the world better. That's the looser version. The slightly more precise version is, as you see here, an instance of evil which God, if there is a God, we don't want to assume that God exists yet in this debate, knows beforehand that it's certain or likely that God could prevent it in a way that would make the world overall better. So that may not be super clear just yet, so let me run through a couple of examples to hopefully clarify it and to tease these two ideas apart.
Okay? Yeah, that'll be helpful.
So suppose that I, using my own free will, reach through the computer monitor here and punch you in the nose. Okay, something I would never do. But suppose I were to do that, right? You might say, well, that is an example of evil. It's a moral evil, right? It was a morally wrong thing to do, to punch the kind host of the show in the nose, right? And so let's look at GE1. right? That evil, that instance of evil, that punching of Jordan in the nose, the occurrence of it doesn't make the world a better place, right? In fact, you might say, look, it makes the world a worse place, right? Okay, so it's a gratuitous evil according to this way of thinking, right? But it might also be gratuitous in the second sense, right? So let's look at the definition here. So me punching you in the nose is an instance of evil that God knew beforehand, before I did it. God, if there is a God, knew beforehand that very likely, or maybe surely, God could zap me, right? Prevent me from doing it. And that zapping me in that way, preventing me from following through with my desire to punch you in the nose, would make the world better overall, right? So that would be a case where it's neither the occurrence doesn't make the world better, and God's permission of it doesn't make the world better. It would be better for God to prevent it. So it's both of these kinds of GE1 and GE2. So, but you might start to wonder, and many people have wondered, well, wait a minute. Maybe there's no great harm done by God zapping me to prevent me from doing evil. I mean, I'm just an ordinary guy about to punch somebody in the nose. Maybe God should miraculously intervene to prevent me from doing this, right? But maybe, just maybe, there are occasions when it would be bad for God to undermine or override my freedom to do it in that way. Maybe it would make the world worse if God were, at least for some people on some occasions with respect to some actions, maybe it would make things worse if God were to miraculously intervene to prevent me from doing this thing. Okay? So then you'd have yourself a case where it's GE1 but not GE2. So my punching you in the nose doesn't make the world better, right? But, so it is GE1, but it's not GE2, right? Because in this scenario, suppose it's not me, but it's someone really important, or for some reason, there's some reason why it would make things worse if God were to prevent it. It would be bad for God to undermine or override my freedom. Well, then it wouldn't be GE2. Why? Because it wouldn't be an instance such that if God exists, God knows that God could prevent it in a way that would make the world better. Things would be worse if God were to intervene to override my freedom. So you could have a case that's GE1 but not GE2, right? Finally, just to tease it apart, I'll try to do this fairly quickly, you could have a case that is really GE2 but isn't GE1. So the key here is to remember that not everyone thinks that God has perfect foreknowledge of the future. Some people do, some people don't. So suppose the people that don't think that are correct. Suppose God only has probabilistic knowledge of the future. Okay? Well, if that view is right, it could be that God thinks, look, it's likely, with respect to some evil, that I could prevent it in a way that makes the world overall better. This is likely. But it might still be the case that if it were to occur, that it would make the world overall better. So that would be a case that's GE2 but not GE1. Okay, so hopefully I've at least gone some way to pulling these notions apart.
Yeah. I don't know that I can summarize it in a succinct way like I usually try to do. Maybe I'll give it a brief attempt here. So GE1, the essence of it is something actually occurs that fails. It doesn't make the world overall better.
That's right. And
So
maybe
there's
it even
something
makes
that
the world
occurs
yeah,
that doesn't make the world overall better. That's
that's right.
GE1.
Yeah,
But GE2 is saying that God, if he prevented that, and he knows that if he prevented that, it's either probable or certain that it would make the world overall better.
that's right. And so from that, it follows that God's permission of it would fail to make the world better. So that's maybe a simpler way, right? So focus on the permission part. So for
Okay.
GE1, what's pointless is the occurrence of the evil. For GE2, what's pointless is the permission of the evil. God had no good reason to permit it.
Ah, yes. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now that we've got those two different ways of thinking about gratuitous evil, when it comes to resisting I'll go back for just a moment. When it comes to resisting one prime there, because that's what we're focusing on in this interview, that premise that says, if God exists, no gratuitous evil occurs. There's going to be some people that focus on GE1 in that premise, and then other people who focus on GE2 in that premise. So we're going to try and explore both directions here.
Yeah, that's right.
So
And in the paper, I look at several authors who look at GE1, but here we're just going to talk about one, and then we're going to talk about two authors who resist the claim that God prevents all GE2.
Yeah. So we've narrowed it down a little bit, but we're trying to keep a relatively representative sample here. Okay, so the first philosopher that we want to look at is Michael Peterson. So Peterson argues for the compossibility. You put these two together, they're compatible with one another. The compossibility of God and GE1. So how does Michael Peterson try to show that God and GE1 are actually compossible?
Yeah, great, thanks. So maybe you can advance to the next slide and I can talk through it a little bit. He offers three reasons. Oh yeah, there we are. So, and I'll just sort of try to talk informally through each of these reasons, and then I can talk about some ways that people might reply or have replied to this way of thinking, right? So, Peterson starts with this idea, at least in his first point here. Maybe it's a great good to have a certain kind of moral freedom. By moral freedom, I mean the freedom to engage in morally good acts and morally bad acts, right? So we commonly think that that's the sort of freedom that human beings like ourselves enjoy. And it's a valuable thing that we are able to do both good things and bad things. It would be a weaker or a lower or a more attenuated or a less valuable version of freedom if we were free to turn left and right, but not free to choose good or bad, let's say. Okay, so extending that thought a little bit, Michael Peterson says, well, wait a minute, really significant, serious moral freedom has got to include having the ability not only to bring about evil, but to bring about pointless evil, to be able to do morally bad things. Part of what makes you a good person is that you don't do these things that are within your power to do, right? We're all, or many of us anyway, are physically capable of doing all sorts of terrible things. And insofar as we don't do these terrible things, really bad things, gratuitous, pointless things, things that don't make the world better, things that make the world a lot worse, insofar as we don't do those things, that redounds to our credit, right? So Peterson thinks, look, God wants to give us this great gift of free will, right? And not just a kind of attenuated or thin version of free will, but a significant, a robust form of free will. And a robust form of free will includes the ability to do really terrible things, right? Including gratuitous things, including gratuitous evils. Okay, so that's the first idea. The second idea is this. We live in a world that is governed by more or less stable natural laws. And Peterson thinks that, and others have as well, that a certain kind of stable set of natural laws is a prerequisite for beings like ourselves to exist and for beings like ourselves to have significant moral freedom. Okay, but once you've got a stable natural order like that, it's inevitable that it's possible that you will have gratuitous natural evil. So notice I've added a little M and an N here. I've underlined them to signal that's moral evil versus natural evil. So in the first bullet point, I was talking about moral wrongdoing. In the second bullet point, I'm echoing Peterson here, and I'm talking about natural evil. So floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, coronavirus, whatever example you like, right? Not caused by morally free beings, right? And Peterson seems to think that this is just a consequence of the natural order, that these things can happen, right? Okay, third one is a little bit more subtle. It involves both gratuitous moral and gratuitous natural evil. And here's the rough idea. It's a theme that you see also in the soul-making theodicy of John Hick, which will probably be familiar to some of your listeners, right? The idea is this, that God wants us to develop, morally speaking. God wants us to mature, in Hick's language, to make our souls. And doing that involves overcoming certain kinds of obstacles. And some of these obstacles are going to be gratuitous moral evils, the terrible things that people do to each other. We can learn from those, we can grow from those, and so forth, right? Evils that don't bring about any greater good, right? The occurrence of them, anyway, doesn't bring about any greater good. Similarly, natural evil, the terrible things that happen, the pain and suffering that's caused by natural forces, those also are an opportunity for a certain kind of moral growth, right? The world, again, importing Hicks language here, is a veil of soul making. The conditions are set for us to develop in a certain way that God wants, right? There has to be a bit of friction, shall we say. And this friction involves, according to this story anyway, gratuitous moral evil and gratuitous natural evil of the first sort. So that's the gist of his 3 reasons why God and gratuitous evil of this sort are compossible.
Excellent. So, in the paper, you point out some weaknesses in Peterson's 3 points here. So, what are some of these weaknesses?
Yeah, I won't get as technical here in this venue as I do in the paper here. People can look at it for sort of greater details, tracing the dialectic through the literature and so forth, right? But the basic idea here is that anyone who wants to criticize this kind of argument can say, well, look, first of all, is it true or is it reasonable, right? Is it reasonable to think that that's the kind of moral freedom that we need to have, that in order to be significant, we ought to be able to do all these terrible things to each other? And I don't need to upset listeners by adding examples here, right? I'm sure we all know just how terrible people can be to each other. I'm on the first bullet point here. We have a sense, I think, all of us, of just how awful humans can behave to each other. Wouldn't it be better, people would say, if God gave us a little bit less freedom? Right? So does the benefit of this kind of freedom, is it really worth the price? That's the gist of this kind of response. Maybe things would be better if we had a little bit less moral freedom, and then there wasn't the ability to do some of the unspeakable things that human beings do to each other all the time, right? That's the gist of that response. The second one, as for the regular natural order, of course, you can probably guess what the objection is going to be here, right? Well, maybe we need to have a regular natural order in order to have a certain kind of moral freedom, but maybe God could, intervene miraculously in order to prevent, the forest fires from getting too deadly, or the hurricanes from getting too big, or whatever, right? So maybe there are things that God could do about it, right? So maybe it doesn't have to involve the possibility of gratuitous natural evil. God could sort of prevent it, right? Do the benefits outweigh the costs here? Again, one could try to resist that. Similarly, this developmental story in the 3rd bullet point, right? Is that really a plausible account of God's goals? Someone might say, does it really require all this much moral evil and all this much natural evil? In particular, does it really require all this much gratuitous moral and gratuitous natural evil for us to develop our souls? Couldn't God do other things? We're talking about an omnipotent and omniscient being, after all. Aren't there other things that God could do to help us move through the maturation process, rather than allowing us to both do and experience all these terrible things, right? So the gist of it, again, is that God could achieve these goals in a less painful or less problematic way, right? So those are ways of resisting these bullet points. But beyond that, I think there's a general acceptance, I think this is fair anyway, there's a general acceptance in the literature that the real problem here for theism is not gratuitous evil in the first sense, but rather gratuitous evil in the second sense. So I think a lot of people are willing to grant that, sure, it might be okay, at least on some occasions, for God to allow some evil to occur where that event or that occurrence doesn't bring about any greater good. That might be okay. But it seems like a harder row to hoe, so to speak, to say that it would be okay for God to allow gratuitous evil of the second sort, when, speaking slightly loosely, there's no good reason for God to permit it. Why would God permit something if there's no good reason for God to permit it, right? So that's I think a general sentiment in the literature here, that GE1 isn't as big of a problem as GE2 is. That's really where the action is, right?
Very good. Okay, so Peterson represents somebody who tries to deny that one prime, that first premise in the argument from gratuitous evil, by pointing out how God is compatible, the existence of God is compatible with this first type of gratuitous evil. But there were some replies here about whether the benefits really outweigh the kind of costs. And also, it looks like that second type of gratuitous evil is the more serious one than this first type of gratuitous evil.
Yeah, terrific summary. I think that's exactly right.
So basically the rest of the video, we want to focus in on this second type of gratuitous evil. And we're going to look at two philosophers, how they handle it. The first is going to be William Hasker, and then the second is Peter Van Inwagen. So let's start with William Hasker. How does he argue? Let me advance the slide here. How does William Hasker argue for the compossibility of God and this second type of gratuitous evil?
Yeah, good. And so I'll answer that. And just to set the stage again before, I just want to underscore for listeners just how ambitious this is, right? I mean, Hasker and Van Inwagen want to say that it's not the case that if God exists, then there's no gratuitous evil of the second sort. In other words, they want to say, as you nicely put it, that God and the existence of this gratuitous evil of the second sort are compossible, right? And that's a really big challenge, right? I mean, they're in effect saying that it's okay for God to allow evil that God has no good reason to permit, right? Putting it slightly loosely. So I just want to underscore how ambitious that is. But I also want to emphasize what capable and able and intelligent philosophers both William Hasker and Peter Van Inwagen are. So these are they've set themselves, I think, a really difficult challenge by focusing their attention on this step of an argument for atheism. And well, it'll be up to your listeners or viewers to judge whether they've risen to the challenge or not. Okay. And I think, by the way, that I want to sort of play up these arguments a little bit. I think they're both extremely interesting and innovative arguments. Okay. So Hasker starts with this idea. Suppose that this really were God's plan, or that this really were a necessary truth, that God is going to prevent all gratuitous evil of the second sort. Okay. Well, Hasker thinks that it's a really important goal for God that we come to knowledge of God's nature. So Hasker thinks that most of us would pretty well come to know, or at least reasonably believe, that this is God's policy. God's policy is to ensure that there's no gratuitous evil of the second sort. Okay. And what's really innovative about Hasker's argument is he then says, well, now wait a minute. Let's think about what the consequences of that would be. Let's think about what would be the consequences, in particular for our moral motivation, if we were to know or reasonably to believe that no evil that is around us is gratuitous in this second sense. Okay? So let's think about it. That's step A. So Hasker's going to say, we're going to find out. We're going to know what God's policy is. So then we get a kind of a thought experiment. So let's take an example. Suppose you see someone suffering, someone who's been treated unjustly for, bad moral reasons, someone who's been morally harmed in some way, right? And then you think to yourself, well, wait a minute. I'm confident that God prevents all gratuitous evil of the second sort. In other words, I'm confident that God permitted that suffering for a reason. I'm confident that the world is better because God permitted that. Maybe I'm even confident of that. But let's go to the weaker claim. God permitted that evil for a reason. Okay. Well, wait a minute. Am I still as motivated as one would normally think I should be to reduce or eliminate that person's unjust suffering? Right? I mean, after all, God allowed that person to suffer for a reason. I'm confident of that. So why would I seek to reduce or eliminate that person's suffering? Well, that's the idea behind step B in the argument, right? Hasker thinks our motivation to behave morally is undermined. We're going to be less likely to reduce or eliminate the suffering of others, right? Maybe.
Can I just
go ahead
on that really quick? So an example, you gave one of where you reach through the computer and punch me in the face. So if you reasonably believed that God prevents all gratuitous moral evil, then now when you're, you have this desire to reach through the computer and punch me, and you're trying to figure out, should I act on that desire? Should I not? Suddenly, your motivation to be moral and refrain from reaching through the computer and punching me, now your motivation is a little bit undermined, because you might think, well, since God prevents all pointless or that gratuitous kind of act, then if I did reach through the computer and punch Jordan in the face, then somehow it's going to benefit. It's going to be overall beneficial, whether to him or somebody else. In one way or another, overall, it's going to be beneficial. So now it looks like your motivation to refrain from it is kind of undermined. Is that the idea?
That is exactly his idea, right? You might almost sort of put a fork in the road like this, right? If I'm able to do it, if I'm able to reach through and punch you in the nose, then I'm certain it's not going to be gratuitous, or I'm very confident it's not going to be gratuitous. And if it's gratuitous, I'm not going to be able to do it, right? So if I'm considering, punching you in the nose or robbing a bank or cheating on a test or a spouse or something like that, I think to myself, well, wait a minute, right? If it happens, it's not going to be gratuitous. God's going to have permitted it for a reason. So suddenly it seems like the moral brakes have been loosened a little bit. So it's not only about eliminating or reducing the suffering of others, but also it seems like I'm more likely to be willing to or keen to cause moral harm to other people, right? Because I know I've got this. God is providing, in effect, a cosmic guarantee that it will never be gratuitous, right? Okay, so that's exactly the idea behind B here, right? So again, it's this thought experiment. Suppose we really would be very confident that God prevents all gratuitous evil. What would the world look like then? Okay, so let's turn to natural evil, right? Okay, so then you think about your floods, your natural disasters, your tsunamis, whatever examples you like, right? And you think to yourself, again, well, wait a minute. These terrible things that happen, God also permitted them for a reason. I'm confident they're non-gratuitous. So why would I seek to reduce or eliminate the suffering? More broadly, why would I seek to develop the kinds of goods that we often normally think we develop by responding to those things? Goods like that involve things like knowledge and courage and foresight and cooperating with others, right? All these good things that we get from fighting the good fight against natural evil. Well, why would we do that anymore if we are convinced, or at least are very certain, that no natural evil that occurs is going to be gratuitous? If that divine cosmic guarantee is in place, we don't have to worry about it. God permitted it for a reason. So again, our response, our motivation, our moral motivation here is again undermined. That's the idea of point C.
What would be a good good example in this case? So I gave the punching case, but that's not natural evil. That would be moral evil. What would be? I know you said so pick a tsunami, say, or something like that. How would this play out in the case of a tsunami coming and, I don't know, wiping out a city?
Yeah, right. So terrible things and not hypothetical things either, right? These things really do happen. And so we can sort of divide cases prospectively and retrospectively, maybe. So suppose it's already happened and you think, well, gosh, should I donate some money to reduce the suffering over there? Well, wait a minute, maybe I won't. Because after all, I'm certain, or at least very confident, that God permitted that suffering for a reason. Who am I to go about alleviating it, right? That's one thought that might occur to you. Or turning to the other kinds of goods I mentioned, maybe you think, gosh, these tsunamis are really terrible. We really ought to have more, well, whoever studies these things, oceanographers, meteorologists, we really ought to do a lot more work to try to figure out when they're coming, to try to give people early warning systems. And as you start thinking like that, then immediately the brakes kick in, because then you think to yourself, well, hold on, wait a minute, if they happen, they're not gratuitous, so why should we worry about it? Right? So both prospectively and retrospectively, Hasker's thought is our motivation to do the right thing is going to be undermined.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So that's A, B, and C.
Yeah, and so D just pulls together A, B, and C, and then of course you've got this claim in E that, well, look, God actually cares quite a bit about our behaving morally. God wants us to have a moral motivation that isn't undermined. God wants us to alleviate suffering where we can, and so forth and so on. In other words, God's plan for creation involves ensuring that this kind of moral undermining doesn't happen. Well, then it seems, according to Hasker anyway, that God's got to allow some pointless evil, right? That's where the argument leads. There has to be some pointless evil because, and I'm speaking loosely now, right? If we were assured, if we were so confident that it was none of it was pointless, then our moral motivation would be undermined.
All right. Yeah, I think you did an excellent job laying out Hasker's view there. So, similar to what we did with Peterson, how have people tried to push back against this argument? What are some of the weaknesses people try to point to?
Yeah, there's been, and maybe you can advance the slide here. There's been a lot of criticisms of it in the literature. My own, I'm going to editorialize just a little bit here. I actually think this argument hasn't really gotten its due. A lot of criticisms have been leveled. I'm not sure they're all successful. I think the argument is stronger than a lot of people think. But let's look at a couple of objections that I think really don't work, right? The first one, and several authors have mentioned this, and I'm sure it's occurring to some of your listeners or viewers as I talk through this. The whole strategy might seem kind of really paradoxical or self-defeating, right? You might say, well, wait a minute. God's going to allow pointless evil to ensure that our moral motivation isn't undermined. Well, that sure sounds like that evil that we thought was pointless has a point after all, right? And that sounds super self-defeating, right? So Hasker, I think, has an elegant response here. In fact, I think it was first advanced not by Hasker, but by William Rowe, who thought of the objection and quick as a wink thought of the reply. And the reply is this. You got to distinguish between the set and the members of the set, or the class and the members of the class. God needs there to be, according to this story, right, if you accept the argument, God needs there to be some gratuitous evil. God doesn't need this particular instance or that particular instance to occur, or doesn't need to permit this instance or that instance in order to achieve his goal of ensuring that our moral motivation isn't undermined. But God needs there to be a class. Okay, so Hasker has this analogy of applause, right? So look, if you've got a crowd applauding, right, it's made up of all these individual members applauding, right? You could stop this member from applauding or that member from applauding, or you could swap another member in or something like that, and you'd still have applause, right? But if you stop all of them from applauding, if you stop all of them from doing this, you don't have applause anymore, right? So similarly, in this case, what God needs is for there to be some gratuitous evil. Each individual instance is not required for the great good of ensuring that our motivation, moral motivation, isn't undermined, but rather the class or the set or the collection, whatever you want to call it, as a whole must exist. So I think that's actually quite an effective response to this particular strategy. It's not as though Hasker's incoherently saying that these evils are both pointless and that they individually have a point. The type has a point. The individual tokens don't have a point.
That's what I was going to ask you. You just used the word token. So another set of terms I've heard used is the difference between type and token. So what you're calling class would be like the type, and what you're calling members would be the tokens.
That's right.
The individual occurrences of it.
That's exactly right. So God needs there to be some of this stuff, but not this exact particular individual, right? Yeah.
So that seems like it avoids the objection that Hasker's argument here is actually self-defeating.
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, I think it's quite a decisive response to this particular objection, right? So another response here is you might say, you might criticize Hasker's story about God's plan for creation. I sort of threw that in there. I don't think anyone sort of seriously advances this, right? But you might say, look, maybe God doesn't care very much about our moral motivation. Maybe that's not a high priority for God or something like that, right? It's a move out there in dialectical space, so to speak, right? But I don't think it's a terribly strong argument, right? First of all, it's certainly at odds with what a lot of theistic traditions have to say about what God values and what God cares about and so forth. The deeper point here is that you only need to be reasonable in believing that this is an important thing for God. You don't have to know it. It doesn't even have to be true. You just have to be reasonable in believing it for the argument to get off the ground, right? So I don't think the second response here is terribly strong as well. Right. More of the action. Oh, and I see something funny's happened with my numbers here. More of the action has to do with the 3 and 1 at the bottom, which is of course supposed to be 4.
Should be 4. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people will get that.
Yeah. So your viewers, your listeners, of course, they'll get that. So the third one then, right? So some people have said, well, wait a minute, right? If the only way for God to ensure that this kind of motivation isn't undermined is for God to permit some gratuitous evil, right? Then what we might say is this: maybe God should prevent it, but not tell us that God's preventing it, right? Remember that first step in Hasker's argument that we're going to sort of find out that this is God's policy, right? Well, maybe God doesn't have to let us know. Maybe God could hide this policy from us. So God could ensure, right, that there's no gratuitous evil, right? But maybe we'd never find that out. And if we don't find it out, then the moral motivation doesn't happen. Or the undermining of moral motivation doesn't happen. It's only when we find out and we think about the consequences, the way I walked through it on the last slide, it's only when we do that that the undermining of moral motivation happens. So maybe God should keep it a secret. Well, you can probably predict the first response already, right? Hasker and others have said, well, look, God's not going to deceive us, certainly not in general, maybe, and certainly not about such a fundamental policy, right? If it really is in God's nature, perhaps, to ensure that there's no gratuitous evil, then that's an important thing about the cosmos that we should come to know, right? God wouldn't hide it from us. That's the first response. There's kind of a deeper response here. I gave it a bit of a maybe over-dramatic title here. But if you think that so let's remember the dialectical context here, right? Someone's offering an argument for atheism. If God, which starts with premise 1 prime, if God exists, then there isn't going to be any gratuitous evil. Again, if God exists, then there won't be any gratuitous evil. But if your response to an objection is to say, well, we would never find out if God were to prevent all gratuitous evil, well, you've actually just undermined your reason for holding the first premise of the argument in the first place, right? You're supposed to be someone who says that it's reasonable to think that if God were to exist, then there would be no gratuitous evil. But if your response to this objection, or your reply to this objection, this Hasker style objection, involves the claim that we could never come to know such a thing, well, then you can't advance your argument for atheism in the first place. So my sort of cheeky way of putting that is to say this is like dialectical suicide, right? You've undermined the argument that you began by supporting.
Yeah, that I hadn't thought of that response. That's interesting.
But I think the most common response here is that a lot of people have said is that it's just a mistake to think that our moral motivation would be undermined in that way, or that it would be sufficiently undermined, or maybe that enough people would find their moral motivation undermined, right? And there's an interesting, there's maybe some empirical work that could be done here, right? Certainly people appeal to, in the literature, to the idea that, look, there are lots of theists who, if you ask them about this, will say, yeah, of course, everything happens for a reason. It's a bit loose, but one version of that is to say that God doesn't permit any gratuitous evil, right? So there are a lot of theists who think that God prevents all gratuitous evil of this sort, and who absolutely don't find their moral motivation undermined. I mean, a lot of these people are at the forefront of serving soup in the soup kitchens and helping the widows and the orphans to speak biblically, and so on and so forth, right? In short, there are lots of so goes the response. There are lots of living, breathing counterexamples to the claim that their moral motivation is going to be undermined by thinking the issues through. They've thought the issues through. They think that it's part of God's nature to prevent gratuitous evil, but they don't find that undermines their moral motivation in any way.
Okay. Does Hasker... I find that a good objection. I feel like a lot of the people I know would want to say that one way or another, God has a good reason for allowing or permitting evil. We may not always know what it is, but I feel like a lot of people, just like sitting in the pews, would want to say, yeah, God's got some good reason for this happening. I don't know what it is. But they don't then they don't then say, so I can go punch someone in the face.
That's right.
Right. So that definitely seems like it's fits my experience. But does Hasker have a response to this?
Well, one thing he points out is that, and I think he's right about this, that he says, look, lamentably, there have been some theists who have said that these things are all for the best and we shouldn't intervene here or there, and it's probably part of God's plan, and so forth and so on, right? I mean, I think both thoughts are out there, right? So I think I forget now. I think one of his examples is about the civil rights movement in the United States, right? And he asserts that there were theists who said, well, we don't need to fuss so much about this because, it's God's will and not our will and so forth, right? So there have been, Hasker says, and I think it's perfectly fair to say there have been some theists who have found some of their moral motivation to be undermined by thinking through these issues in this way. But of course, the problem is that there are these clear counterexamples on the other side, right? Hasker basically winds up saying, well, look, these people are confused. The people whose moral motivation isn't undermined, they might be perfectly moral, but they're deeply confused, right? Because something in their moral system doesn't make sense anymore.
Or maybe, yeah, I may not say they're confused. Probably in my experiences, they might not have reflected on it very much.
Yeah, right. That's right. So they're not sufficiently reflective, or if they are, they're somehow in a muddle or something like that. Yeah, yeah. So it's I guess it's an open empirical question, and I think here the burden of proof has to be on Hasker, right? Hasker's the one giving this argument. Hasker's got to give good reasons for thinking that enough people would have enough of their moral motivation undermined that God is going to have to permit gratuitous evil in order to ensure that that bad thing doesn't happen, right? I'm not persuaded that Hasker has made that case myself. So I have a lot of sympathy for this fourth, labeled as one, this fourth objection at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah. Okay, so that was Hasker's case for the possibility of the existence of God with GE2, the second type of gratuitous evil. Now we want to shift to the final philosopher we'll look at, Peter Van Inwagen. I'll go ahead and switch this over. So how does Peter Van Inwagen argue for God and GE2?
Yeah, great. So it's a very different strategy and a very innovative and I think creative strategy. And it requires a little bit of setup. So let me run through the setup here. He tells two stories, and he thinks that these stories are true for all anyone knows. They are, to put it in technical language, they're epistemically plausible. They're not known to be false. Okay? The first story goes something like this. I'll try to be brief in telling the stories because I want to get to the point of them. The first story goes like this, or I'm just flipping to my notes to make sure that I get this more or less. So it's called the expanded free will defense, and it goes like this. Over many, many millions of years, God guided or assisted evolution in order to produce really clever primates, proto-humans or whatever. And at a certain point in evolutionary history, God miraculously raised them up to the level of humanity, and they lived in wonderful communion with God. They had preternatural powers that allowed them to avoid any natural evil, pain and suffering due to natural causes. And, they didn't sin, right? Prelapsarian kind of a story. But then, of course, they sinned, right? Traditional Christian idea, certainly, right? They sinned, they turned away from God. As a consequence of this, they lost their preternatural powers. So now they were subject to natural evil as well as moral evil. So they've been separated from God. We have been separated from God, Van Inwagen would say. But all is not lost because God, this is a familiar story, right? God has instituted a rescue plan, a plan of atonement. And the important thing for our purposes about this story is as follows. It's important for this rescue plan to work that we come to learn how terrible it is for us to be separated from God. And for us to really learn that, we need to experience vast amounts of evil. That's a requirement in order for us to, return to God. Okay, that's obviously about moral evil primarily. Second story is called the anti-irregularity defense. And this also has to do with God's desire to bring about creatures like ourselves. The idea was this. God had to have, basically similar to what we saw in Peterson, God had to have stable natural laws in order for creatures like us to evolve, okay? But the only, or maybe the best way for this to happen was through kind of a brutal evolutionary process, which included an awful lot of pain and suffering, right? And every world that God could have made that contains creatures like ours either would have contained equivalent or greater suffering, right? Or else would have been massively irregular, would have been incomprehensible in some way, or wouldn't have had stable natural laws or something like that. Okay. So Van Inwagen says, look, these stories are true for all anyone knows. Both stories, as you'll notice here on the slides, right, they both involve a kind of account or a claim about what God's goals are. God wants to, in the first story, God wants to bring people back to him, right? In the second story, God wants to bring about these kinds of creatures in the first place through an evolutionary process, right? And then crucially, you've got this claim here that God has to permit lots and lots of evil in order to achieve these goals. Okay. Forget about the details, right? This is really the core of it. In order to achieve God's goals, God has to allow lots of evil. You could tweak the stories, you could change them a little bit, you could put your own flavor on it, right? But you've got to have this core idea that God has to allow a lot of evil to achieve these goals. Okay. Well, here's a naive idea, or at least an idea that Van Inwagen would say is naive. Fine, let's grant that in order to bring about some goal, God has to allow lots of evil. Fine. Well, God's perfectly powerful and perfectly good and perfectly knowledgeable. So God's going to permit the minimum amount of badness or suffering or evil that will allow God to achieve God's goals. How much evil is God going to permit? The least amount, consistent with achieving God's goals. The minimum. Okay, that seems like a natural thought, right? I have certain goals for my children, and I know that sometimes I have to allow, my children to suffer in some small ways for some small periods of time in order to achieve these goals. For a parent, it's pretty easy to fill out that story, but surely I'm only a good parent if I allow them to suffer the minimum amount possible, consistent with achieving my goals. Fine. Well, here's Van Inwagen's innovative move. Why do you think there's a minimum? Maybe there's no minimum amount of evil that God must permit. Now, here's what he's not saying and what I'm not saying. He's not saying that God could achieve his goals without allowing any evil at all. That's not the point. Remember, look at the middle of the slide. God has to allow a whole bunch of evil for God to achieve these goals. Okay, so there's got to be some evil. Van Inwagen's claim is that there's no minimum amount of evil. Now, that's going to sound really weird. Maybe you could move to the next slide and I'll try to make it sound a little bit less weird. Okay. Suppose you're a judge. This is an example of Van Inwagen's, right? Suppose you're a judge and you are sentencing somebody, okay? And you think to yourself, well, 10 years sounds pretty good. 10 years for whatever the crime was. That's going to have a salutary effect, a deterrent effect, a retributivist effect, whatever you think the goals of sentencing are. 10 years sounds pretty good. But wait a minute. I mean, couldn't you achieve basically the same goal? Couldn't you, in fact, achieve the exact same goal if it was 10 years less a second? Why didn't the judge pick 10 years less a second? Okay, maybe you think a second is too big. Well, why couldn't the judge have picked 10 years less a half second? You can see where this is going, right?
Yeah.
That would be pretty good too, right? Well, why not, 10 years minus 2 seconds or 10 years minus a millionth of a second or something like that, right? Arguably, there's no minimum amount that the judge can sentence someone that's consistent with the judge's goals. Okay? I'll skip the medicine example in the interest of time, but you might say, this is a human thing, right? This wouldn't apply to God. Okay, says Van Inwagen. Well, here are a couple of divine examples. Suppose that God, in order to achieve some purpose, wants an impressively tall prophet to appear at a certain time. That's going to achieve God's goals. Let's just stipulate that. Well, is there a minimum height that you have to be impressively tall? Well, probably not. There's no clear, precise cutoff between not tall and tall or between not impressively tall and impressively tall. There's a kind of sliding scale, and there's no minimum height that you could be, no precise minimum height you have to be in order to be impressively tall. Or finally, maybe God's purposes involve or require a certain country to be fertile at a certain period of time. Okay, well, what is it for a country to be fertile? Well, among other things, there's got to be the right amount of rain. Well, is there a precise, exact minimum number of raindrops that must fall on a certain geographic region at a certain time for the country to be fertile? Clearly not. There's no minimum number. There's got to be some rain, right? But within these broad parameters, there's no precise minimum. Okay, how does that apply to evil? Well, his key claim here is what I call no minimum amount, or NMA. For any amount of evil that's good enough for God's purposes. Which purposes? The purposes that were in those stories from the previous slide. There's some very slightly lesser amount that would serve God's purposes just as well. Okay, and here's where the rubber hits the road. If that's the case, then ultimately it's okay for God to pick an amount of evil within certain broad parameters arbitrarily. And no matter where God draws the line, this much evil, there's going to be some evil that's on the other side of the line that's pointless, that God could have prevented, right? And thereby improve the outcome of the world. So that's the key claim here. There's no minimum amount of evil that God needs to permit for God's purposes. Just like there's no minimum number of raindrops for a country to be fertile, or there's no minimum number of nanoseconds for a criminal to be sentenced that will achieve the relevant goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so Van Inwagen's, the way that he resists one kind of has two steps, basically. Step one is to say, for all we know, one of these stories, it could be the case. It's possibly true that these are God's goals, but in order to achieve those goals, there has to be this vast amount of suffering. So how much suffering exactly counts as, vast enough? Well, it's just going to be a minimum amount that God's going to allow that minimum. That's kind of step one. And then step two is to say, but wait, if you think about it, there isn't a minimum. There could always be one less token of suffering, one less member in the group. And so if God includes whatever God picks, there's going to be an element of pointlessness in that particular instance, in that particular token. He could have prevented that and still achieved. But that's not on him. That's just because by the very nature of what we're dealing with, there's no minimum.
That's right. There's no precise minimum. Just like there's no precise minimum number of grains of sand that you need in order to make a heap of sand, and there's no precise minimum number of hairs you have to have on a head, an example that's relevant to both you and I, in order to be hirsute and not bald, right? There's no precise minimum amount of evil here that you need in order to achieve God's goals. So God's going to draw a line somewhere, somewhat arbitrarily, right, within certain broad parameters, of course, and no matter what, there's going to be some evil that occurs that God could have prevented and made the world better, and so that evil is gratuitous. So then it's not the case that if God exists, there's no gratuitous evil.
Yeah. Okay. And what seems interesting with this approach is it seems like as long as this is possibly true, then it's enough to undermine or undercut one.
Yes, exactly right. He thinks
right?
that he doesn't think he's proven that premise one is false. He thinks that I should have said this, right? He doesn't think that he's proven that premise one is false. He thinks that we can be reasonable in suspending judgment about one, and that's good enough to defeat the argument, right? If you can show that I don't have to endorse this premise, that's good enough to block the argument. And so you don't have to endorse the premise, he thinks, because it's true for all you know that, and then they come the stories, right? Those stories are true for all we know. Not known to be false, epistemically possible. 3 different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sure there's been pushback on this argument. So what are some of the weaknesses people have tried to point out?
Yeah, right. So you sort of teed it up very nicely here, right? So the first thing that someone might say is, well, look, Van Inwagen, you claim that these stories are true for all we know, but look, here are some reasons for thinking that they're just false, right? So Schellenberg does this. He's got a section in one of his books where he wants to argue contra Van Inwagen that these stories are not epistemically possible, that they're known to be false. We have good reason for thinking, Schellenberg says, that this is not what happened, that there wasn't a prelapsarian state, and so forth and so on, right? So you could say, look, these stories are no good, right? In a way, we can adjudicate that, I suppose, but any version of those stories will do, provided you get this claim that in order to achieve some goals, God has to allow some evil, and then the claim that there's no minimum amount, right? So if you don't like these stories, maybe there's some other ones that will do the trick, right? So that might be a way to respond to this first reply, right? As long as it has that overall structure, right? So that's one move. There hasn't been a lot written about this, but I do want to say that the Canadian philosopher J.L. Schellenberg does run this move against Van Inwagen, right? Interestingly, a far more common move in the literature is to just basically grant the argument and then say, yeah, but Van Inwagen, this isn't the real problem. The problem is not that God allows some gratuitous evil in the second sense. The problem is that there's so much of it. So now we've got a new argument for atheism, right? Now it's the argument from excessive gratuitous evil instead of the argument from gratuitous evil. And, that's fine in terms of, someone can run an argument for atheism like that, but it really doesn't engage with Van Inwagen's argument, right? In effect, it grants the argument, so it doesn't criticize it. So in a way, it's like shifting the conversation. So I'm not going to say more about that. The most direct way, and there's been stuff written on this, the most direct way to criticize this argument is to criticize his NMA claim, the claim that there's no minimum amount, right? So here's an interesting thought that a number of people have said in the literature. You can see the citations in my paper if you like. Someone might say, well, wait a minute, hold on a minute. Let's talk about pain and suffering. Those aren't infinitely diminishable. Look, there's a certain threshold, right, of fine sensation below which we can't feel the difference anymore, right? There is sort of extreme pain, and then there's mild pain, and then at a certain point you just can't feel it anymore. There's a hard line below which we can't detect pain and suffering anymore. So it's not as though you could always take the pain or the suffering and cut it in half and cut it in half and cut it in half. It wouldn't be detectable anymore. And if it's not detectable, then it's not pain and it's not suffering, right? Okay. So you might imagine that that's where someone would draw the line. There is a minimum amount because there's a minimum level, what can I call it? A minimum level of perceptibility, right? Below which, if the stimuli are so small, we're just not going to be able to feel them anymore. Seems clear, right? Okay, a couple of responses to that reply. One response is to say, and this is due to a former student of mine, friend of mine, Chris Dragos, who says, well, look, actually, the issue is not pain and suffering. The issue is evil, okay? And let's remember, pain and suffering isn't sufficient or necessary for evil. Now, that might seem a little bit surprising here, right? So let's break it down into both parts here. Pain isn't sufficient for evil. Look at a minor case of stubbing your toe or bumping your elbow or something like that. Sure, there's a little bit of pain involved, but we don't typically want to say that it's evil, right? Or at least a lot of us wouldn't want to say that it's evil. It's a little bit of pain, it's a little bit of suffering, it's not evil. Or maybe a better example is this: people suffer voluntarily in order to engage in various kinds of athletic training, right? They freely and willingly undertake this kind of pain and suffering. That's not an evil at all. So pain and suffering doesn't suffice for evil. That's not really the main point. The main point is this: pain and suffering isn't necessary for evil either. And that might seem a little more surprising. Well, let's tell a story to see if I can make that clear. Why are pain and suffering not necessary for evil? Well, suppose you're the victim of a financial moral wrongdoing. So you've put all your life savings in the bank, in your local bank, but there's a renegade teller or bank manager there who's stolen the money out of your account, engaged in moral wrongdoing. So that's really bad. But here's the twist, right? There's always a twist in these thought experiments. There's also, quite independently, been like in Monopoly, a bank error in your favor. And that bank error, just as it so happens, has put the exact same amount of money back in your bank as you were swindled out of. It's okay. So you never knew that it happened. You never were aware that you were the victim of this financial crime. You really were the victim of moral wrongdoing. You really were the victim of a certain kind of evil. But you didn't feel any pain or suffering because you didn't even know that it happened. Okay, so pain and suffering, if you buy that, isn't necessary for evil to occur. So this response wants to say, look, forget about pain and suffering. The issue is evil. Is there a minimum amount of moral evil that is necessary for God's purposes? Now, I focus here on moral evil because you might say, fine, moral evil doesn't have to involve pain and suffering, but maybe natural evil does. Right? It's hard to think of an example of natural evil, evil caused by natural forces, that doesn't involve some sort of pain and suffering. So maybe this response only applies to the moral evil part, but not the natural evil part. That might be a problem for this response. But here's another response. This is a response given by Andrew Cullison in a terrific paper on this topic. And he says, well, maybe it's true that for most of us, there's some threshold below which we can't feel increasingly delicate or sensitive or small stimuli, right? But look, things didn't have to be that way. Maybe there could be other creatures that God could have made that had much more finely grained perceptual apparatus than we have, right? So maybe then there's no minimum amount, or maybe God could miraculously intervene to ramp up our sensory abilities even now, to make us increasingly able to detect ever smaller forms of pain and suffering, right? So it's, in other words, it's not enough to say, oh yes, there's a hard line of detectability in pain and suffering. Maybe there's a hard line for creatures like ourselves, but maybe it's a mistake to think that the only creatures this applies to is creatures like ourselves, right? So that would be a way of bringing back the idea that there's no minimum amount of pain or suffering that God has to permit in order for God to achieve God's goals. You can't get out of it by saying, there's this limit of ordinary humans.
Okay, yeah. All right, well, we walked through the argument from gratuitous evil, looked at the two different types, looked at Peterson's way of trying to show that the existence of God is compatible with that first type of gratuitous evil. And then we looked at Hasker's and Van Inwagen's way of showing that the existence of God is compatible with that second type. And we looked at some objections and responses. So hopefully that gives the viewer a pretty good sense of what the literature looks like. Obviously, if people want to dig in more, they'd go and read your paper, but at least that's a helpful start.
Sorry to interrupt. I do have one more response to Van Inwagen's argument, which I can run through if there's time.
Okay. Right. Okay, go ahead.
So if you can move the slide one forward, I can mention that, because I saw you were sort of getting into your wrap.
I missed that one. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So, and I'll run through this fairly briefly. The central heart, I think, of Van Inwagen's move here is an appeal to what is called divine satisficing. So here's the structure of the argument, right? He concedes that God could always achieve a better outcome. God, what does that mean? God could always allow less evil, right? But he denies that so doing would always be to perform a better action. So he's trying to sever the link between the goodness of the outcome and the goodness of the action. Okay. So there's this idea in economics and in rational choice theory and in ethics called satisficing. It's a made-up word, a combination of sufficient and satisfactory, right? And it's this idea that it can be okay, morally or rationally speaking, to pick a good enough outcome, even though you could have picked a better outcome. That it's okay to do the good enough, even if you could have done better. So I think that Van Inwagen's argument really is an appeal to divine satisficing. And I think that divine satisficing is going to be difficult to make plausible, right? I don't think I have a knockdown argument here, but here are a couple of points, right? First point I want to make is that satisficing is pretty controversial in human cases, in ordinary cases, right? Even in kind of idealized scenarios. So for example, a lovely example from the philosopher John Pollock, right? Imagine a kind of wine that gets better and better, but unlike wine that gets, real wine that gets better and better and then gets worse and worse, this wine gets better and better and better without end, right? A lot of people are going to say, well, look, a rational wine lover is going to be totally reasonable in drinking the wine at a certain point. That's good enough, even though it would have been better to wait by a day or a month or a year. Now make the wine lover immortal, so there's no worries about the wine lover running out of time, right? Well, in a scenario like that, a lot of people are going to say it's perfectly fine for the wine lover to just open the wine at some point, even though it would always improve. But not everybody agrees, right? Some think that this is just a failure of rationality, that there's no rational move to make here, that you're always being a little bit irrational when you drink the wine on day 12,000, when you know it would have been just a little bit better on day 12,001. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's controversial even in human cases. And then some of the motivation behind satisficing in human cases just doesn't apply to God, right? So one author says, satisficing can be motivated by an appeal to moderation, right? You might not have a second helping of dessert, even though in some sense you'd be better off if you had that second helping, but it's good enough. You're employing moderation here. Well, that kind of logic doesn't transfer to the God case with permitting evil and preventing evil, I think, right? And finally, you might wonder whether it's good enough for God if it's permissible for God to allow a certain amount of evil, even though God could have prevented it, right? So here's the idea. Something might be good enough, but it might still be the case that it's a supererogatory action. That's fancy philosophy jargon for doing more than your duty or more than what's required, right? So satisficing opens up space for supererogation. You might say, look, it's okay to do what's good enough, even though you could have done better. But it would be supererogatory, morally or maybe even rationally, to go beyond what's merely good enough. Okay, that's a pretty familiar idea for humans. Well, then, if something like that applies to God, it seems that we've got a problem here, right? Because then it seems like the merely good enough isn't good enough for God, because you would expect God not to merely do what's good enough when a better option is available, when God could do more than what is minimally required or something like that. Okay, last thing I'll say about it, I know we should wrap up here. In a way, Van Inwagen's argument here is really an instance of the so-called problem of no best world, which goes roughly like this. No matter what God creates, God could have created a better world. Suppose that's true. That certainly is implied by Van Inwagen's scenario here. So what world is God going to pick? Critics of theism have argued that no matter what world God picks, God could have picked a better world, which means that God could have performed a better action, which means that God isn't surpassable, right? Which means that God can be surpassed by someone else who picks a better world and does a better action. So in effect, this strategy here, I think, falls victim to this other argument for atheism.
Well, I really enjoyed this interview. I summed it up a moment ago, a little prematurely, but how would you like to conclude this discussion?
Yeah, oh, well, thanks for the opportunity. First of all, I've really enjoyed talking about this stuff as well. So I want to underscore again the ambitiousness of trying to criticize the first premise of this kind of argument for atheism. It's a really ambitious task. We got to be precise, as always, in philosophy with our terms. And I just want to underscore again the really creditable and intricate and technical arguments of Hasker and Van Inwagen. I hope I've made them reasonably intelligible here. But these are ultimately, I think, very serious attempts to show that, to argue for a very surprising conclusion, namely that God and pointless evil can coexist.
Thank you so much for laying it out for us and coming back on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
If you're interested, again, in going deeper, check out the paper in the description. But I also have an entire playlist of videos on the problem of evil, and you can check those out as well. So thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.